which aim to kind of use really interesting pedagogical strategies combined with technology to help underrepresented and low-income students in India reach elite institutions, mainly through helping them prepare for different types of competitive examinations. He also co-founded and launched a startup that was more for-profit and kind of focused on test prep in a similar space. And now he has refocused back on Avanti Fellows, which he's been doing the entire time. And Avanti Fellows has been doing some really interesting stuff. So they've moved from just focusing kind of on high school entrance to much broader swaths of education. They're focused almost exclusively with government partnerships and low-income populations in India, kind of even by India's standards of low income. So it's pretty equity first. Really interesting thinker. I think the plan is Akshay is going to talk for around 35 minutes, and he wanted to have it be a little bit more discussion based. And so rather than at the end, if you have any questions, it doesn't have to be like one question, get off the stage. You can ask follow-up questions, or if you disagree or something, feel free to challenge and have a little bit of a more rousing discussion as we wish. But thanks again, Akshay, for being here. Good to see you, and please take it from here.
Oh, super. Thanks, Owen. Thanks for having me. And I'm quite excited to have this conversation. I think the way I've structured this is I'll kind of just tell you a story, right? So I'll just tell you a story of what's happened with us over the last couple of years. And I think it's been really interesting to sort of, especially from the perspective of challenging some of our own conceptions about what a good product is and how it can work and what really changes learning outcomes. And I'll try and skim through this, go through the slides as quickly as I can, and leave as much time as we have to then have kind of a to and fro conversation. And I think perhaps what might be useful is to view this more as an exercise in helping me brainstorm an answer to the problem I'm going to pose, and we can go from there. Cool. And Owen and I have worked together for many years. Much of the last 11 years of my life have been focused on helping kids in government schools, which are terribly funded, poorly performing as a consequence, I think, schools in India where typically at this point in time, kind of the bottom 50% by income of the population study. And you see many of the same things that you'd hear about since many of you study social inclusion and education, some of the same challenges you see in many other countries, only taken to the max, to the most severe possible extremes. And we try to keep trying to solve these with the least possible amounts of money. So often that's the problem that we're solving. So I'll try to share some slides, walk you through the problem we're trying to solve in one state in India, in Haryana. And hopefully this is something that sparks a few ideas and some conversation. So let me start there. Share my screen. A second. We just do a tech check, and I have now somehow managed to not be able to share my screen. Just one second. There we go. All right. So hopefully you can all see, can you see my slides? Owen, can you see?
I was on mute. Yeah, we can definitely see your slides. Looking good.
All right. Cool. So Owen already talked about Avanti. Our core focus has always been, and for now 11 years, been on helping kids lift themselves out of poverty in a single generation, which means that by the time they are adults and maybe in their 30s, their family is out of poverty. And most research in the space points to the fact that one of the only real ways you can do that consistently and reliably is by giving them access to really high quality undergraduate education or even skilling courses that then get them high quality, high employability jobs. So like Owen mentioned, a lot of the early work was focused essentially on the top of this pyramid, which is helping the kids who were gifted and talented get into really elite schools. And as the span of our work has increased, we started working with larger and larger populations with larger and larger mandates. So now we help kids become everything from nurse practitioners, laboratory technicians to engineers, doctors, and lawyers. And as a consequence, we now start to deal with large populations of students and problems that an entire state in India, for instance, would encounter. So like I promised, the case study here is one of Haryana. So it's a small, very, very small, in fact, northern state. And in many ways, it's actually an easy state to work in. All the people in the state speak the same language. The schools are largely Hindi medium. It's flat, which means that data connectivity and 3G connectivity is reasonably good. But it is very typical of most Indian states where, it has a lot of kids. So you have 750,000 kids between grade 6 and 10. By the time they get to grade 10, most of them are on an average, 4 grades behind, which means that the school teacher is typically dealing with clusters of kids, let's say in grade 9, all the way from grade 3 to grade 9, and trying to teach them in a single classroom. And the state spends somewhere between $400 and $500 a year per child. So the budgetary constraints on what additional investments they can make tend to be limited to $100 a child a year or thereabouts. So that's typically the constraints that you're working with. And traditionally, the way people have tackled these systems is to introduce worksheets, workbooks, special summer camps, blended learning, and a bunch of other techniques in class. And for about 3 years before the pandemic, this is what we were doing in Haryana. So we were running an in-school blended learning program where we created digital content for the teachers to use in class and workbooks for the teachers to co-teach with. And we evaluated it with a randomized control study, which JPAL ran for a year just before the pandemic broke. And just before the pandemic, this is what we knew, right? So we knew that we had to teach at the right level. And this is something most of you would have come across by this point, which is you really cannot have kids learn unless the learning materials are at the right level for them. And any amount of learning time that they spend not learning at the right level often leads to not just no learning, but often a degradation in learning levels. So you've got to teach at the right level. How you do that in a multi-grade classroom is a different question. And when you're able to do it either in summer camps or focused, tracked classrooms, many studies, including our own, have found pretty significant improvements in learning levels when you do teach at the right level. The graphs on the right are from a study we did in Chennai about 4 years ago, where we had an after-school program where we tracked kids and then taught them through a blended learning model at the right level, and we saw pretty significant increases in learning level and shifts across learning levels, almost about 0.6 of a standard deviation or 40% in a single year from that study. And there's a lot of other studies that substantiate this. The other learning is perhaps less obvious, which is that you cannot substitute instructional time. So many interventions, including the one that we evaluated with JPAL in Haryana, have found that when you try and tweak the classroom, which is you say, look, you still have the same 6 hours a week or 7 hours a week for math, but I'm now going to make your teacher do something different, lead to either one of two things, right? They either end up focusing the class on a very specific sliver of kids, as is what happens often with technology or blended learning interventions, where you give them very good content, which is at A level, often at the level of middle of the class or the top of the class or the bottom of the class, that ends up focusing teacher time quite narrowly on that subsection of class, which in our case actually led to a negative effect, which meant that the kids that we were focusing the content on, which was the top quartile of the class, improved quite dramatically. But the other kids actually got significantly worse compared to the control. And you see similar effects in other studies. And in the best case, what we've seen with large scale studies is that you create a very small effect, maybe 0.1 of a standard deviation, right, at a population level, by doing interventions to try and improve classroom instruction in middle school. The effects of such interventions in primary school have been quite dramatically positive, right? Because most kids are starting from a similar baseline, they're all starting kind of at a flat zero. So which means that generally improving the effectiveness of teaching means that the classroom outcomes improve. But when you get to middle school and you're dealing with kids who are at different learning levels, if you don't address each child at their level and increase the amount of time they have, what you end up doing is actually teaching to one segment of kids. And that's what we're finding frequently in not just ours, but other research in India. And the last one is something I'll come to, which is something we learned from the pandemic as well, which is at least traditionally with EdTech, all of the data pointed to the fact that online live classes or where there was a teacher involved tended to have dramatically higher engagement when compared to any form of asynchronous learning. And most of you would have seen studies on Coursera or on other forms of async learning that in general, teacher guided instruction, either in class or even online, tended to work better than instruction that was not guided by teachers, or where there was not a consistent teacher face. And then and knowing this, and we were still trying to figure out what we wanted to do with our on-ground programming, the pandemic kind of broke, and then for 2 years, all of our kids were shut out of school. What happened during the pandemic was, in some ways quite incredible, but in other ways quite distressing, which is that the country had no plan, right? So we had no real plan on how to respond to the pandemic. And there were very few people who actually had digital learning content in Hindi, which is what close to half the people in the country speak and learn in school. So we ended up anchoring efforts across several states where kids were organized onto WhatsApp groups. And they were sent daily lessons, and in the early days, these were simply just YouTube video links or small PDFs. And over time, we built more sophisticated systems to send them lesson plans and eventually even online live classes to participate in. The good news was that the uptake was phenomenally high, right? So we had close to 70% of all the kids that we enrolled in the state participate in some way every week, right? So they would either take a test or they'd consume some of the content we sent them. And this led to, I think, during the first year of the pandemic, a lot of optimism around the ability to use digital solutions to possibly provide this additional instruction that kids would want. And this also led to some pretty, in my mind, rushed policy decisions, with several states deciding to buy lots of devices and tablets and internet plans for children, right? And hundreds of millions of dollars being assigned in budgetary allocations towards the purchase of devices. And just to give you a sense of what was happening, this is kind of what was happening, right? So the kids were getting on their parents' phones messages on WhatsApp where they would then use, complete assignments in their workbooks, fill in Google Forms, watch video content, which was in equal parts inspiring to see these kids make these efforts to actually try and learn by themselves in the absence of school. But also distressing because all this while we had the data, so we knew what this meant. So even though we had at one point in time 100,000 kids participating daily, we knew that the average session length was, a few minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes long. And as most of you who have been educators recognize that, learning for 3 minutes a day does not really lead to any material shifts in outcomes. And that was also starting to get borne out by test scores in the test scores and other data that we were being able to gather at a student level. But I think one of the positive things that did come out is we ended up having to build a pretty robust technology platform to allow WhatsApp to function as the primary LMS, essentially, right? So these kids were using multiple different devices and WhatsApp on multiple different devices to consume lessons of various formats, either live classes or interactive quizzes or video lessons or read PDFs, all through messages and links on WhatsApp, which meant that all of our interfaces had to kind of use a URL as a starting point. And recognize the fact that this URL will be clicked on by a particular child from any random device that they might get their hands on during the day. So it required us to build in quite a different way, and that was fun. And all in all, this still works quite well, right? So the teachers use simple web apps to pick lessons and send them to kids. The students receive messages, prompts, alerts, reactivation messages, almost all the things that you see as notifications on apps on WhatsApp, including their report cards, prompts to keep learning. All of that happens through WhatsApp for children. And these messages are sent to multiple WhatsApp numbers that we've seen the child use over the course of the year. We've had to build flexible authentication, which means that you have to account for students joining from multiple different devices. You have to account for multiple students joining from the same device, and still try and make sure that our data is somewhat sensible and makes sense at a student level. And one of the tools that we ended up building was the ability to convert any YouTube video into an interactive lesson, which is essentially take a YouTube video, layer quizzes or questions at different timestamps on the video, and thereby allow with a single URL to deliver to the child something that combines a quiz along with a YouTube video. And during the pandemic, this worked really, really well because we were unable at that scale to actually deliver any kind of live classes or synchronous classes to children, which meant that these kind of interactive video lessons actually did a lot better than simply sending a YouTube video or simply sending a quiz in isolation. And we found that, you know, if you looked at the view rates of videos that were on which we were able to layer interaction versus the same videos when they were sent in other cohorts where we weren't layering interaction, you saw almost a 5-fold increase in the percentage of kids who watched the whole video. So this was quite encouraging data for that one particular tool. But the question was, like I mentioned earlier, that we had usage, but was it meaningful to students, right? And I think the flip side of it is a lot of what we were doing during the pandemic was state mandated, right? So the state was issuing a diktat to teachers, parents, and to students that, you know, during the pandemic, all learning will be online. You will be sent lessons, you're supposed to complete them, and you'll be sent quizzes every week, which will count towards your eventual assessment. So you're supposed to take them. So a lot of the usage that we were getting was kind of state mandated, top-down driven, which meant that when you dug one layer deep into what that usage really meant, you started to see that it was a lot of it was superficial, right? So a lot of kids would, you know, simply open quizzes, mark responses, and submit them. A lot of kids would open interactive lessons, skip to the end, submit the answers, and move on. And it was a very small cohort, about 1 or 2% of the total user base that was meaningfully using the lessons that we were sending them. And this started to become what we found and what a bunch of other nonprofits and government agencies found from kind of this, after the initial euphoria of mass adoption of WhatsApp as a learning medium for low-income kids in public schools. As we started coming out of the pandemic and schools started reopening, we started to see pretty massively tapering curves of, you know, weekly active usage per school, right? So we started to see that the vast majority of schools had very, very low percentages of kids using the interactive lessons or the asynchronous learning lessons regularly enough to actually affect learning outcomes. And we then started to push more heavily for live classes, given that we had prior data that these would work better. And the long story short here is that kind of after school tracked, targeted live classes, you know, where we were able to track kids into deeply remedial, needing some remediation close to grade level, and provide them lesson plans that were very, very targeted to their levels, worked incredibly well. In fact, the participation rates are almost 4 or 5 times that of the best performing schools with asynchronous learning. But perhaps what's more encouraging is that the average time per week per child is in excess of 2.5, 3 hours when we do live classes, where it was about 10 minutes when we did asynchronous learning. So in the evolution of our program, we went from being completely in classrooms to being completely asynchronous to being completely synchronous or live class based. And we started to even find that once we started giving live classes, kids didn't want to have interactive videos for their quizzes and wanted to do kind of vanilla quizzes and only use interactive videos when they wanted to do revision or they wanted to do self-paced learning. So the big learnings, I think, during this period have really been that it's really, really important when we build these large scale interventions to keep an eye not just on usage, but on the quality of usage. And also keep kind of the educator's lens to say, look, how much minimum usage really leads to meaningful learning outcome shifts. And I think over the last now, I would say 6 or 8 months, where we've been running in a post-COVID world and we've been working with a much smaller cohort of about 160 schools, we found that, you know, interventions like sending teacher reports, leaderboards, displaying physical report cards in schools around and after school learning intervention have helped us get kind of average weekly participation rates to in excess of about 45–50% in most schools, which is phenomenally high for a program that's still after school, still online, and still requires a child to consume about 3 or 4 hours of live classes after school. And in kind of early data that's coming out, we're seeing pretty significant shifts also in learning levels. And not only are these shifts significant, they're also pretty significantly correlated with how much time kids are spending on the platform. But sort of this transition to synchronous classes then poses a different question, which is, this is still very much teacher-driven, highly operationally intensive intervention. And while we were doing asynchronous learning, the great thing was the answer on how you would scale this was obvious. You just get the algorithms to work well enough that kids learned well, and you'd get the right gamification and nudges to work, and everyone would do it, and it'll cost pennies. But that didn't happen. And when you start doing more conventional teacher-led or teacher-guided instruction, the question for any kind of large-scale implementation then becomes, how would you scale this across 750,000 students? So I thought I'd pause actually on this question, because it hopefully sets up with adequate context for you, sort of as a practitioner in the space, the challenges we see with EdTech, right? Which is, and if I were to just take a minute to kind of recast them, right? There's all of the things that you'd want to achieve tend to compete with each other, right? So scalability and low cost tends to also mean low personalization and low human touch, typically, right? So lower teacher guidance lends itself to scalability, but teacher guidance lends itself to motivation and engagement, right? So you almost are always juggling between, and I think any EdTech product you build, if you build it for profit, the more humans you use, the more expensive the product is, the lower your margins are, the lesser amount of money you can spend on customer acquisition. If you work in a nonprofit, it affects how much the state has to spend per child. And this trade-off is actually one of the central trade-offs to figuring out EdTech, right? Which is, it's not only a question of building software that works really, really well for a motivated kid, it's also about solving for motivation. And if you don't solve for motivation within your product, inevitably what will happen is you'll have to spend the same amount of money solving for motivation outside of your product, by hiring program officers or the government or schools having to invest in people to put kids in labs. So if you look at the net cost of the system, it ends up almost always ending up to be the same, right? So there's good examples in India of another piece of software called MindSpark, which is an excellent piece of software which does adaptive learning at younger grades, so typically from grade 4 to 10, which has great RCTs that show tremendous learning gains. The kids sit in labs and learn, right? But when they've tried to implement it in government schools, they're again finding that the cost of the system of taking away time from regular school teachers to devote that time to lab time, and then the effort involved in not only setting up the labs, but also moving kids from classroom to labs and keeping them there and monitoring them, adds to the cost of the intervention, right? So I think what I wanted to just leave you with is a little bit of these trade-offs, right? Which is, I think especially given I'm an engineer in my early years of building EdTech, my answer was always, how do I get rid of the people, right? Like, people are stupid, they're unreliable, how do I get rid of them with code? And then I became a teacher, and then my bias became, how do I get rid of this technology which is getting in the way? And these are very real trade-offs, because even when you design, at small scale, many interventions will work. But when you start to design for scale, I think that finding the right balance between kind of the human element of tech and kind of making the tech appropriate is often what most of you will end up struggling with in any context. That's also what we're trying to solve for. I don't think we have great answers, but I thought I'll just dump all this data on you and see what you guys have to say.
Awesome. Thanks, Akshay. That was great. Really fun to hear how things have been going over the last year. Everyone on the call, so I mentioned this earlier, but we kind of kept this a little bit shorter so we had more time. And so more than just one-off question, the idea is to pitch in. You can give ideas, so it doesn't have to be one kind of respectful question and then exit the stage. I'll just start just to get the energy going, but please engage. I think actually one of the first things I saw that I just would like you just to dive into a little bit deeper is you said that early on that you have to augment, if you're doing EdTech intervention, you kind of want to augment the amount of time, whereas if you try to substitute it for teacher time, there's sometimes kind of mixed or negative effects. And could you just explain that one more time or kind of unpack it and what you think some of the mechanisms are there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I can maybe talk to two specific interventions, right? And I think this will make it clearer. So our core intervention before COVID, which we were trying to push through. So I'll give you a little bit of history there. So we started as an after-school program. So all of our programming was after school, which meant it was in the category of adding hours to the child's day, right? So all the programs worked really well. The pedagogy worked well. The outcomes data was fantastic. everyone was really excited. And then the question became, how do you scale this? Because after school programs don't scale. And then we spent a bunch of time kind of adapting that after school program to the in-school setting. And what did that mean, right? It meant that the teacher would not teach the way they taught normally, and they would have to run prescribed lesson plans that we gave them. And we tried our best to find the right level at which to set those lesson plans, but there were still one too many broadcast lesson plans. And in our intervention, what we found was that, and specifically in math more than anywhere else, that while workbooks were fine because teachers could teach around them and adapt their teaching style, adapt them to their teaching style, when you gave them videos, they would spend 15 minutes of their 45-minute class showing videos, and then often another 10 minutes explaining what happened in the video, right? So instead of being a 45-minute interaction with kids, it became a 25-minute video explanation session and a 15-minute interaction with children. And funnily, not only was the effect of this that they couldn't, walk around the class and help kids who were falling behind catch up or motivate children, it was also, it caused a lot of anxiety amongst kids who weren't understanding the video materials. So there was also like psychosomatic effects on kids and other such things that we found. And the disruption of having moved to an AV room, right? So the positive effect we had on the kids who the content was targeted at far was overrun by the negative effect we had on the others. A different implementation of this is what I was talking about in MindSpark, and there was a recent presentation at the RISE conference as well, where they had pretty significant learning gains when they did an after-school program where kids came and spent a couple of hours every week on this self-learning, adaptive learning piece of software. But when they tried to implement it in public school settings, they had to take away periods from teachers and give them and assign them to the computer lab. So even though they saw gains, they started to see teachers really struggle with covering course material, and it's and that reduced their gains, right? That reduced their overall gains, and they also see pretty significant variances between schools. So the gain that was, half of a standard deviation is already down to less than 0.2 of a standard deviation, right? At which point it starts to become marginally impactful. So truly, the only evidence.
Yeah, just I think that's really interesting. I just want to ask one more clarifying question on that. So I think there's two ways to think about that at first surprising decrease in performance, but then once you unpack it, that seems somewhat intuitive. One is that you are, there's a net gain of just normal classrooms, and then you have the net gain of the after-school classroom. And if you kind of substitute the after-school classroom for the in-classroom time, you're kind of like the total time teaching is less, and so you'd expect a more moderate gain than the whole time during the class. But another way of thinking about it is like somehow by substituting this intervention that isn't actually well fitted for the way the classroom operates, it makes both the intervention ineffective and kind of blows up whatever gain you get from the normal class. And so I was wondering if you see it more of kind of like just a net reduction in time teaching, or if it's like kind of it's like mutually destructive to the benefits of that teaching time.
Our experience is mutually destructive, which is that school classrooms so you can do some things in after school classrooms which you will never do in school, right? You can track kids, you can say we're just going to do a very small subset of the curricular matter, etc. And you could, unless you change kind of the broader structure saying you have to cover a certain amount of curriculum a year, when you start interfering with like curricular coverage without fixing the amount of curriculum to be covered, you're kind of destroying both models, right? You're destroying kind of the focused laser, pointer kind of approach of after school programs. And you're also breaking up kind of the more congenial, like community building aspect of like teaching a classroom. Even the kids aren't learning that much, at least they're building confidence and connections and some reason to be connected to academics, right? So you tend to interfere a lot with both, is our learning.
Awesome, that's super interesting. Anyone else, please jump in here with any questions or thoughts you have. You can either raise a hand or unmute yourself.
Hubert, Owen, you're muted too.
Sorry, yeah, Hubert, yeah, go ahead for it.
Hi, I'm Hubert. I was just wondering, really interesting observations. Have you thought about if your observations that you've been thinking about sort of the role of technology and when it's beneficial and when it's not. Do you think it's different for different age groups? So we teach postgraduate students, which are often mature adults. And I was just wondering, do you think it would be any different for them, or do you think some of the things that you've learned from your experience might apply in that setting as well?
So I think even within our students, it's different for different students. So we find that when I talked about the 1% that were doing really well with asynchronous learning, that was also very heavily correlated with the best performing kids in the school system. So there's basically always a layer of kids who are self-directed learners. I would say would represent almost any grad student. These are people who know how to learn on their own. They know what they want to learn. They have a learning plan. And for them, self-paced learning is actually preferable. So they still prefer to not come to a synchronous class where they're stuck listening to an instructor. Unfortunately, that's the minority of kids. And in school systems, primary school kids, not us, but many others are finding that you have to involve the parents a lot more because the kids just cannot manage these interfaces really well. In middle school, we find pretty significant differences in learning behavior between these kids who are kind of self-paced learners and kids who are not, and they have different preferences. And then in high school, and this is, I think, an India-specific issue where the course curriculum is so intense that there's actually a meaningful time issue where we're finding our best performing kids actually prefer lower touch interventions. And it's our moderate performing kids who prefer higher touch interventions. So there's going to be lots of differences based on student age and learning behaviors.
Janine?
Yes, thank you so much, Akshay. That was really interesting to hear how Avanti organizes. You kind of mentioned this already, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how students and also teachers, and obviously that would really differ depending on the school and the year. How are they involved in the designing of these programming?
Yeah, so I think that's been, I think that's an ongoing journey, which is the students are very involved because I think all through we continue to have a small sandbox where we talk to the kids every day. We ask them for feedback, and they essentially in many ways design the programs. For instance, students pushed us to make the programming really late at night. So now our online classes run at from 9 to 11 at night, because that's when, and this is this will not get recorded, but because there's an alcoholism problem in the state, this is when the fathers have finished drinking and have fallen asleep. So that's why they want to do classes in the middle of the night, right? There's also been a lot, students have now started taking leadership roles in the community organizing, which is the WhatsApp group moderation. So that's been really interesting. On the teachers, we had a bit of a rather counterintuitive learning, which is we initially started off with trying to get the teachers to anchor the after school program, which is we said, hey, you help direct what we teach, what we cover, and we will give you kind of teaching assistants to cover the online classes because we can't expect you to take them. And gradually found that they preferred to actually get reports, but let that program run kind of autonomously, especially when it was a catch-up program. So they have a preference for focusing their planning time on the kids that are close to grade level, and kind of outsourcing the kids who have to catch up to us because they can't spend any time. So kind of compartmentalizing for the teachers, or helping them compartmentalize became something they wanted us to do, and which actually really helped us because then we get buy-in without having to negotiate with them. So they are involved. I think I wish they were much more involved in the lesson plan design, which they're not at this point, given just the pace at which we've had to move. But that's the thing which we want to now, both in terms of the designing of the lessons and actually even the conduction of the lessons. We're trying some experiments with see whether we can get senior students to teach junior students, or we can get community-led teachers and so on and so forth. So that would, I think, be the next thing to try.
Erika?
Hi, Akshay. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's actually very similar to my dissertation at this point, which is why I was very interested in knowing how it worked out in Haryana, because I'm looking at Gujarat. And Haryana has much more digital penetration compared to Gujarat. Even the kind of kids in their class backgrounds are very different. So I was just thinking in terms of the most marginalized student in Haryana, do you think through this intervention during the pandemic in particular, you were able to reach that group through your online interactions? And if not, why? Like, what are some, apart from basic access issues, can you think of something else that might have stopped it?
So here's the two things, right? Which is in terms of reach, I think we got to pretty high levels of reach, right? So we got to about 80-85% levels of reach at the peak of the pandemic. And by reach, simply meaning that we'll be able to enroll the child on WhatsApp and get them to do something, at least a weekly test. And then the kids who were not participating were not actually because of lack of device access. It was often because of their home situation where they had been put to work in the fields and other such things, and there wasn't parental support for learning. That was the biggest factor in kids not participating, not device access as much in Haryana. And this might be specific to Haryana. But that's my intuition, though, that it's often actually a parental buy-in question more than it is a device question, because most families have some device. But from the perspective of learning, which I think is the more important perspective, we've now done baselines pre and post, and we found a pretty consistent learning loss, right? So despite whether it was kids who participated or kids who didn't participate, I don't think anything we did in the pandemic, by we I mean broadly in India, led to any learning gain. I think the positive effects of it seem to be, at least from our small pieces of research, seem to be much more around maintaining well-being and keeping kids in school and those kinds of things. Like, it had positive effects of like keeping kids connected to learning, but I don't think kids learned very much. And that will start showing up in like the new surveys that come out on learning levels post-pandemic, right? Unless we fudge the data, which might happen. So.
Could I go for a follow-up if there's no one else? Okay, perfect. Which is very consistent with what my teachers have told. Children have forgotten how to write, and they've just completely lost touch with regular doings of school. And so in Gujarat in particular, they ended up doing something called Sehri Shikshan, which is street education. So teachers started going to mohallas and doing teaching smaller groups of students. And was there something similar in Haryana? One, and second, just because even through your own research, you've seen that instructional time has a lot of gains in terms of learning to the child. How do you justify a tech intervention in such a scenario when we know that just by giving students more time with the teacher face to face helps them in learning better?
So I think the one similar stuff happened in Haryana, continues to happen, but I think also happens in patches based on how enthusiastic teachers and community workers are. So I think the approach we've used is you obviously maximize teacher time, right? So you don't take anything away. As much teacher time face to face as you can give the child, you give them. But then that has an upper cap, right? So that runs out. And I think, at least for us, where we are finding it's really useful is to, beyond that, for the kids, if they want to spend a couple of hours every day learning at home, the only way you can give them teacher time is by giving it online. And the only way you can get them to do kind of focused learning time is by doing it digitally. Like, there's no other answer, right? So, and there again, it's by digital, it's not only purely digital, it's digital aided. So we're finding when you give them workbooks, physical workbooks that they can work on, which tie in with the digital lessons, that it leads to higher engagement. When you give them printed report cards, they prefer it. So I think there's a lot to be done around kind of blending it into what seems normal to children. But on the whole, I'm very optimistic, right? Because all of this, like everything that's happening after school now, is stuff that wouldn't happen at all. So even if we are marginally improving things, it's at least a possibility of doing something fundamentally additional and new and better for kids. And the other, I think, really interesting window it opens up is now we have hundreds of thousands of kids who are working with us directly as kind of B2C, like direct to student customers, right? Who are kind of coming in every day. So now you can actually interact with them, do user studies, test stuff, do A/B tests without having to use the state as a kind of in-between buffer, or like public school system as an in-between buffer, which allows for many other interesting, fascinating kinds of research and many ethical questions, but opens up a kind of whole world of possibilities of what you could try and do with kids, right? So we're now tracking them into different batches randomly without telling them. We are varying the amount of time children get. We are trying gender segregated batches. We're trying mixed gender batches. So all this stuff in a public school, to do it physically is impossible. So it's really good for learning for us as well, like to have kind of access to the kids directly.
Guys, anyone in the audience, keep on thinking of more questions. I'm just going to jump in here. Actually, I think when we were talking last week, and then also this came up a bit, a really overly crude representation of, how much a student learns in a year could be something like the time spent learning plus the amount they're learning, so the number of hours they're learning and how much they learn per hour or something like that,
Yeah.
a very crude estimate. And then, when you think about trying to increase the total amount of learning, you can either increase the number of hours or you can increase the quality of learning. And obviously the number of hours are finite by a variety of factors, just hours in the day to begin with, plus some of the things you said. You're like, well, we can really only get teachers to teach kids, 6-7 hours a day, practically speaking. So I think there's lots of interest in trying to optimize the amount of time. Optimize what's being done with that time. And I think that you were talking about, you thought there's kind of like an upper rate limit to kind of how much someone can learn per unit time. So you're like, well, sure, we could make this, 20% more effective, but if a kid's far enough behind, you can't like catch them up 7 years in 1 year. And so I was wondering any thoughts you had about kind of like which time versus quality of time optimization, what some of those upper limits are, some of your thoughts about kind of the marginal benefits of making optimization gains in learning design. And Ted, you're next.
Yeah, so I think I'm not, I think at least intuitively, not a big fan of over optimizing. Because I think the biggest factor, I think, in the amount of time the child spends, so there's kind of the max available time, right? And most kids don't spend the max available time studying. And the big factor in that is actually motivation. So I think just like with anything else, you need a certain amount of slack time and time to kind of ponder and mull over stuff, like to just like not be kind of optimally like cramming content into your brain to really learn and to be creative. So that's one thing to be kind of very cognizant of. And that's something we found in our study, also kind of hidden in the data, which is that we were actually affecting how kids viewed science and creating anxiety because we were trying to optimize, right? We were trying to cram more information in the same amount of time. So that's something to be really conscious of, which is when you try and over optimize the kind of velocity of learning, you're also possibly creating anxiety and doing other things which may have a long-term knock-on effect. And when you're right, I think there's an upper limit to what you can do there. So maybe another framework is to think more about mastery, right? And say, is it better for a child to master 6 things instead of and attempt to learn maybe 10, as opposed to master 1 thing and attempt to learn 50, which is kind of what happens now. So a lot of, I think, where, at least in my mind, policy reform has to happen is actually reduce the amount of stuff that kids need to master. But if they do master them, you have to give them unlimited things to master, but you cannot force everybody to try and master stuff that we know historically through all the data we have in the world, no one really does. Right. So I think that's kind of the problem, which is we're trying to keep like the minimum bar of achievement so high that people basically just never build a culture around mastery. And then you get into like this engineering optimization, productivity optimization loop, where the macro is so terrible that even if you fix the optimize the velocity of learning, you're still not really going to change the big outcome.
Okay, thanks for that. Ted, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, thanks. Really overall interesting. I also empathize with the showing a video, then having to explain the video for 10 minutes, like really classic problem. And you think you find a good resource, but appreciated that. I also found really interesting the idea that teachers sort of were taking advantage of the opportunity of after school programs to sort of compartmentalize like certain children in certain buckets, because obviously like that makes the work of the teacher easier because they can focus on certain kids during their class and then have the assurance that after school, like some other kids will get additional help. I'm curious though, like also, I mean, all of this speaks to the problems of scalability and all of these things, but in terms of sort of your vision for like what the ideal role of a teacher would be in working with sort of the after school program. So what do you think is possible or interesting, sort of an interesting sort of possibility, and also, are there any examples of sort of different models of that you have experienced? I'm really interested in like sort of like what role the teachers might play that you think could have a positive effect overall.
Yeah, no, so I think the role that teachers are playing, even in our current programming, which is the most effective role, is they're the only people that can be custodians of student motivation. Like there's only one owner of student motivation, it's the teacher. right? And we find that it matters more than the parent, it matters more than everything else, right? So the children will do what the teacher says, especially in like public schools where they've had consistent time with that teacher. So so I think their ability, so I think for me, the few things, right? Which is one, they have to understand any tech-led intervention. Like they have to be the owners of it. So if they don't understand it and own it and don't understand the rationale for why it's being done, it'll never succeed. The other is, I think they have to be contributors to its design, right? So if they don't feel like they are, and like this answer will be different for different teachers in different settings, right? But if they cannot be contributors to its design, they will not support it and they will not be able to understand how to make it succeed either. And I think the thing that's been very empowering for the one thing that I feel like the teachers who've been the most successful are the teachers who've shown some enthusiasm for the digital learning medium, right? So even if they took the odd online class, right, they showed up once in a while and just co-attended the class. Like, you know, so there's an online class happening, they showed up and they said something to the kids and they went away, you know, after the first 15 or 20 minutes. Sort of their endorsement of whatever is happening, I think makes the biggest difference. So I think what we need from a policy perspective, I think rather than making them customers for EdTech, I think making them the designers of the EdTech intervention, I think is really, really, really important, right? And I think we have to find ways to allow that to happen. I think the more that happens, the more successful they'll be and stickier they'll be. And the other is to also recognize that it can't work for everyone, right? So it'll work for certain segments of kids, and maybe, and that's my current thinking on at least our intervention, that there's no way I can scale this for every child in the state, but maybe this becomes a more focused, targeted intervention for a certain type of child that can then be scaled at least for that audience first, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, that's interesting, sort of making teachers partners in the process a little bit more, which may cut into some of the time EdTech companies would spend doing that same sort of an intervention, right? So there's a tension there between sort of profitability and also maximizing like results for students and classrooms themselves, right? Which I think is an interesting tension. So thanks, cool.
Anyone else? Yeah, Figni.
Okay, I'm just going to squeeze in another question if no one else has a question. This is not kind of directly related to the program, but how Avanti operates, because a lot of us have kind of practitioner experiences, and we know that in low resource setting, it's very difficult to have an impactful program with the resources that we have. I'm wondering, can you speak a little bit about the kind of private partnerships that Avanti is involved in, you know, both with celebrities like Priyanka Chopra and also just private companies, and how are these kind of relationships with states, but also these private partners work?
So private partners just help us raise money, I feel like, more often than not. No, but I think there's a few things, right? Just one is a few things that really help are actually the partnership, not just with the state, but with the politicians helps a lot. So most of our programs are kind of celebrity endorsed by politicians, right? So it will be like the chief minister something and the someone something, which means we get a lot of free press and you get a lot of free airtime, right? So marketing gets solved. Like from an EdTech lens, you get like your top of the funnel marketing kind of solved for by these. It also means they take all the credit, which we're just fine giving them as a nonprofit. In fact, we prefer that. So that really helps. So marketing and PR really, really helps. Like you have to built some like pull for the product, otherwise no one's going to even try to use it. The other is, I think that on the technology front, a lot of our advisors are actually for-profit EdTech entrepreneurs in India, right? So we like many of our operations SOPs are just copy pasted from some of the larger EdTech companies because those people wanted to help and they gave us know-how and we took them and we copied them. So it's helped us kind of like skip a lot of learning loops that we probably wouldn't have had resources to go through. So that's really helped, and actually helped them with employee retention and motivation because they can see a clear positive outcome of what they've spent learning, right? Not just to make money, but to also help kids learn. So those are two, I think, that have really helped in this journey.
While someone else thinks of your next question, actually, could you just think of a few high-level innovations in EdTech broadly defined, and then just do under or overrated? So it doesn't mean good. Under and overrated isn't good or bad. It just means that the hype isn't warranted. So I would say that I think that I would say like micro learning via TikTok is actually, I think it's even money because I think it doesn't have a very good rep, but I also think it's not that effective. So just chew on that. I'm gonna let Ted jump in here. So just let that going back there because I put you on the spot, but Ted, jump in.
Yes, I was actually curious about the thing you just said about the for-profit edtech company advisors from India. Is there any threats of competition, or are they sort of completely different in different spheres?
So so honestly, we'd love competition, right? So
Yeah.
there's a large number of kids. I mean, what does competition look like for us, right? For us, competition looks like someone coming and teaching kids for free, which we're very happy if they do, right? And actually, the only way for our programs to sustain, to be honest, is for them to be handed over contractually by the government to for-profit players. I think we cannot run by ourselves. So we are more like an applied research org than we are kind of a large operational organization. We don't want to be and we can't be, right, as a nonprofit. So the hope is that we can create enough know-how on how to run these programs that we could eventually get other kind of break them up and get people to run some of these interventions, right? So it works well both ways. We're finally now being able to actually create contracts and tenders in the government where edtech players are being able to bid for them. So that's actually a stated goal. We want them to come in. And yeah, so it's been actually all good, no problem so far.
With your experience in edtech and for-profit edtech in the past, do you see any challenges or risks there in terms of? I think you've sort of talked about problems of scalability, right? And how a lot of the time spent in classroom and time spent with teachers is the most rewarding. So any fears about that?
There is. I mean, so I think a lot of, because I think showing that, I think there are two big challenges with edtech, right? Which is one, people don't buy your product because they're learning. Very few people buy the product because they're actually learning, because learning happens after they buy the product, right? So 9 times out of 10, you're buying the product because you think it fulfills some deep unmet need or some insecurity, right? So most edtech products end up being designed to target kind of a sense of like this deprivation. And as a consequence, their entire DNA then becomes to fuel that, right? So you will not go in and say things like, hey, we need to create a holistic model where everyone's involved in solutioning. Like, that's not going to be an answer. It's going to be teachers suck, they can't teach in class. So if you don't give them this, it's not going to happen, right? So it's always going to be extremes. And that's a danger, right? Which is why it's actually, if edtech companies are to solve these issues, then the government has to be really educated. Like you have to have like people like us on the other side who are like counter-writing those agreements, right? Otherwise,
that sounds great, yeah.
So which is why it's so difficult to get them done. But I think we'll get there. I think there's enough money available, and I think there's enough pressure on edtech companies to scale that they're running out of paying kids, that they will have to eventually work with the government. So I'm hoping that can be as sensible as it can be. So we'll see. Or we just go full open source, and that would be my dream, but I don't know if that'll happen.
Cool. Actually, I'm going to cancel my underrated, overrated question. I'll do that for you offline, but we only have 5 minutes left. And so what I was hoping is if you could just give some general thoughts. A lot of the folks on this call are either about to enter or just finishing up an MSc program. And some of them might be looking to go into more academic routes, but I think a lot of them are maybe looking to go into kind of government positions or edtech positions or something broadly defined. And I think all these folks are probably mid-20s, late 20s, and just any thoughts, maybe what you thought that some of the folks on this call with their skill sets, what they can bring, but I think what might be more interesting, and they generally could get less exposure, are kind of like interesting roles or spots or functions that people might not know. So for instance, like maybe being assistant operations manager would be really cool at a startup, even though that might sound kind of dry at first. So any kind of roles or niches you think might be fun for people to do, or they should think about some more.
So I think that's a good point. So my sense is that, especially if you have some research background, the good thing about edtech is people don't understand anything, right? So beyond, I genuinely think that we don't have good research and good data that's at least publicly available on most parts of the journey, other than the sales, right? Which is how do you create demand and how do you get people to buy stuff. So everything from the day-to-day, everything from how to manage large numbers of let's say synchronous teachers working with clients, whether it's in fitness or in life skills or in elderly education, right? Like how do you run the ops of lots and lots of teachers, and how do you run large scale training and how do you measure effectiveness of classrooms using technology at high scale? Like these are all very interesting questions, which are unsolved questions. I think a lot of good tech will actually get built, which is useful doing this kind of stuff, right? Which is I have, right now we have every day about 300 live classrooms that run simultaneously. So there's no way humanly that we can even go in and know if they all ran well, right? So there'll be, and the edtech companies have 10 times, 20 times, 100 times the scale, right? Especially those who are doing any kind of live instruction, whether it's fitness or education or life skills. So there'll be a lot of tech actually just in classroom monitoring, student satisfaction, tracking usage, which will be very small problems but very interesting problems at high scale. And you might want to land yourself in a customer support team or a data science team working on the sales side to like try and unpack good answers to tiny problems. And I think that's often actually quite fascinating early on. The other one is to be generally optimistic and not get bogged down by the fact that things don't work, right? Like these are all very complicated problems, right? Like, and I don't think anything will ever kind of work perfectly, right? So I think it's much more a matter of, are you furthering learning? And kind of take like the master's mindset into the job, which is like, are you like net after 2 years of doing this, is there any new knowledge that we've contributed to the space, even if it's commercially, right? To move things forward, because I think we are really, in the very early days of edtech, starting to be a meaningful part of how people learn, right? So I think that's important to keep as perspective, because it's very easy to kind of get like mired in the politics of it, which is that they're good people and they're bad people and they're people making money and their kids who are not learning, and that's all true sort of, but that's true of almost every area. So I think being in general like a tech optimist is helpful, because it will kind of set you up to learn and contribute knowledge, which I think is actually what we need the most of. And yeah, I am very optimistic. Like I think lots of stuff we've done hasn't worked, but it's great. We did some new stuff. And that's the most fun part.
Awesome. I think that's a great way to end it, and very true to you, Akshay. Always learning, being optimistic, trying new cool things, and making the world an incrementally better place, little by little. So thank you so much for your time today. Thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully this was as interesting for you as it was for me. And yeah, you can find Akshay online if you want to follow up, email or tweet at him or whatnot. He's pretty responsive. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.